everybody. Welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 29th, where we are, according to the syllabus, in our catch-up class, which means that we get to put closure onto A Raisin in the Sun. And I wanted to talk a little bit about historical time periods for the dramas. And then next class, we can begin in earnest in our poetry section. If you remember, I'd given an extension for journal number 2, which is about the 3 dramas that we've been studying. First, Oedipus the King, the second, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and the third, of course, being A Raisin in the Sun. So thank you for those of you who submitted in that journal before the Thanksgiving break began, but you can also submit in the journal today if you are watching this on the 29th, and it would be due at 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And I'm thinking about approximately a page or so response for each of the 3 journals. And that said, you know that the journals are evaluated informally. I think of it as a kind of conversation on paper, and I will evaluate it on a check mark system, much like I did with journal number 1, and return that back to you, and hopefully that will help inform some of your ideas for your second paper, which will be very similar to the first paper, the distinction being that this time, rather than writing about short story, you would be writing about drama, approximately 4 to 5 pages, a critical paper, so you're not doing outside research. And according to our course outline, paper number 2 is due on Thursday, December 8th. I would take paper number 2 up until the 15th of December. Believe it or not, that happens to be our last class. So what that means is that you would have enough time to write a journal about poems, and that means that your journal would be very similar to what you've done with journal 1 with short story and journal 2 with drama. This time I'll ask you to choose 3 poems out of the poetry unit that we are reading. And obviously we'll be reading more than 3 poems. So much like the short stories, you get some choice. And to write approximately a page or so response to each of the 3 poems that you select. And I will try my very best to get that back to you by the final examination. And we don't have time to write a paper number 3 on poetry, but we do have time to take a final that would be devoted mostly to poetry. And the time for the final is the time that is selected by the college for us if we were meeting in person. So that means that our final exam will be posted on the 22nd of December. That happens to be a Thursday at 1 p.m. And you have 24 hours in which to complete that final. Keep in mind, if you were taking that final in class, you would take approximately 2 hours for that final. So that's how much time you should invest into that final, approximately 2 hours. And 80% of that final, the bulk of it, will be on poetry. What I'll be doing is I will be selecting 2 poems from, or a handful of poems, I should say, from the poetry section, and then ask you to choose 2 and to analyze those in depth. So that said, it's open book, open notes, so you can utilize things like your journal responses and my responses to your journals, as well as our class discussion forum questions and our class videos. So the best way basically to study for that final exam is to read all the poems, watch all the videos, answer all the discussion questions so that you can synthesize all of that. Now that's 80% of the final, 40% for each poem that you select, 2 poems. So 40 and 40 is 80. So that leaves 20 points left over, 10 points for a short story and 10 points for drama, where I will ask you some brief questions about either short story or drama, and you'll have some choice as to which to select. And that would basically give closure to the semester as a whole. So we'll talk a little bit more about the final exam as we get a bit closer to that. But what I wanted to do today was to basically put closure on A Raisin in the Sun. And I believe we left off by talking about Langston Hughes's poem, What Happens to a Dream Deferred, that this particular poem helped inspire the title A Raisin in the Sun, though the title in and of itself, without even thinking about the poem, has lots of possible interpretations for imagery and symbolism, much like we were talking about the character names having the same. And if you think about a raisin, which is a dried fruit, something that has lost some of its moisture, but it's still surviving. And you could say that that perhaps represents the younger family where they've lost some of their life force, but they're still surviving. That said, if you were to leave a raisin in the sun so it would completely dehydrate, well, then basically it would lose all of its nutrients and it would be useless. And the same thing with the younger family is that they're getting very close to basically self destructing. And that said, obviously, you've got color imagery with raisins being dark and the sun being light. Lots of light and dark imagery in this play, particularly because we're talking about ethnicity and the Lindners of the world, the light skinned individuals, as opposed to the Youngers of the world, the darker skinned individuals. But also, you can think about the idea of raisin being a very informal way of saying raising when you drop your G, and this entire play is about the family raising themselves up, trying to improve their situation. And of course, they are also raising sons in particular, SONS, not SUNS. And that would be Mama raising Walter, and Walter trying to raise Travis. Though, of course, in many ways, Mama is raising Travis as well. And the poem reads, "What happens to a dream deferred?" And that first line is a wonderful opportunity for a paper topic there. We're talking about deferred dreams in A Raisin in the Sun, because all of these characters have deferred dreams. I was suggesting that the play centers around the idea of the American dream, which oftentimes is represented by home ownership, by financial security, by education. We see how all of that is represented in the play, but just dreams in general. And the poem reads, "Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun?" We're talking about those dreams deferred. "Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode?" And I can't help but think of many of these characters. For instance, exploding, definitely that would be Walter, where he seems to be almost on the brink of violence, where he talks about that he's a volcano. Or sagging like a heavy load, and that happens to be Ruth, who is so tired. We talked about the furniture itself being tired, but that at one point she says she'd carry her baby on her back, the load of that child. Or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet. I can't help but think of the neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, and that although she's oftentimes left out of the drama performances, she is so important in terms of our understanding the many obstacles that the Youngers face. And one of the obstacles happens to be within their own community. She pretends to be supportive, but she's really not. It's all a lie. That syrupy sweet. Or does it stink like rotten meat? And the idea of festering like a sore and then running, the disease, decay. And think about how Benito wants to be a doctor, basically cure disease. But perhaps the biggest disease in this play is the disease of racism, as well as other diseases such as the disease of sexism, for instance. But at any rate, what I wanted to do was to make a couple of points about how Mama is searching for a home for her family and sunlight. Oftentimes, there's reference to there not being enough sun in that particular apartment. And having a garden, a place of growth. And Mama really is a gardener of both the plant, which is such a great symbol for the family itself, but also for the family. And she's trying to grow the family. Walter and his concern with wealth and wanting to be a business owner, independent, but also family caretaker. And talked about how some of the scenes that are sometimes deleted in productions of Raisin in the Sun give us more of a sense of another side to Walter, a softer side. For instance, when he talks about all the college catalogs in the world surrounding Travis, and that he would want Travis to be able to pick whatever college he wants. So we can see that Walter isn't just caring about his own dreams, but about the dreams of other family members as well. And Ruth wanting a home for her growing family and privacy. Think about the incredible challenges of living in the same home as a mother in law, but especially in the younger situation where it's a small apartment and there aren't bedrooms enough for everyone, and they share a bathroom with multiple apartments on the floor. And Benitha wanting an education and her career and her identity. And, Benitha is in many ways quite contradictory. She is independent, certainly in her career and educational goals. Yes, she's dependent because she still lives at home. So I think that she talks about how she is searching for her cultural identity, and yet there are many things that she does that's quite assimilationist, including dating George Murchison. But that's perhaps one of the strengths of the play, is that we've got nuanced characters. Human beings tend to be contradictions, so these characters, I think, very much illustrate human beings. And the positives and the negatives of poor Travis wanting to earn some money by carrying groceries. Whether it show that he has a unique work ethic. After all, even Benitha's not working, but Travis is indicating an interest in doing so. Or is it that at such a young age he's already become obsessed with money because of the role model of his father? The literary stage directions with the furniture being tired at the beginning of the play to illustrate how tired the family is. That furniture is sagging under a heavy load, just like the family is. The scrambled eggs, which show the troubled state of Walter and Ruth's marriage when he asks for eggs that aren't scrambled and she begins to scramble them. A little bit of passive aggressiveness there. But also, I think it shows just how scrambled Walter is, in terms of his thought process about how a liquor store is going to be their salvation. Lots of episodes of sexism. Probably one of the biggest is when Walter confronts his sister Benitha and asks her, or demands of her, why can't you be a nurse like other women, or just get married and shut up? Think about the transformation that occurs by the ending of the play when Walter tells Lindner and she, Benitha, she's going to be a doctor. And he says that with obvious pride. The meaning of money, as Walter and Mama are talking about that on page 74 in the version that I had assigned for the class, and that Walter believes money is life, and Mama responds, money's life. In my time, freedom was life. So we can see some of the generational conflict that exists within the play. Even something as minor as George Murchison's white shoes are so important, again with the black and the white imagery. But this idea that he is assimilating so much so into white culture that he's even wearing white shoes is just another way that he's become white. The purpose of school, he says, is, and it always makes me sad, is to basically learn facts so that you can get a job and earn money. He's in direct contrast to someone like Joseph Asagai, who talks about wanting to go back to Africa and to help the populace. One of my favorite quotes, and there are many in this play, but it's on page 104 after Mrs. Johnson, the nosy neighbor, leaves. And basically, we are told that there are two things we as a people have got to fear. One is the Ku Klux Klan, and the other is Mrs. Johnson. And what a great paper topic that would be, about all of the different levels of discrimination this family faces. Not just the most obvious and overt, which would be represented by the Ku Klux Klan, but the most subtle of all, the Mrs. Johnsons of the world, friends and neighbors, or supposedly friends and neighbors. And I think I had mentioned that there are lots of biblical references in this play. Religion and conflict over religion is important. But when Beneatha says offhandedly to Mr. Lindner, 30 pieces and not a piece less, as she's making reference to the money that was given to Judas to betray Jesus. So talking about how Lindner is basically betraying them. And I would I would probably say my second favorite quote. My favorite quote is probably when Mama says, "When is the time to love somebody? When they've done good? No, it's when they've done bad and they're at their lowest." But my second favorite quote is on page 121 when Ruth and Benitha are talking about why the welcoming committee is so frightened about the family moving in. And the question is, what are they afraid of? That we're going to eat them? And the response is no, that we're going to marry them. And that, I think that quote is so telling in terms of the fears and anxieties of the time period. And it was about interracial marriage. And in many ways, it still is. Mama talking about the plant expressing her. What a great paper topic that would be. How does the plant express Mama? And then ultimately, Walter's transformation. And I don't know if that could have happened if he hadn't have been entrusted with the money and he had the opportunity to fail and fail spectacularly. And of course, we debated this in the attendance question. We don't know for certain. This is all conjecture. But I do wonder what would have happened if Mama had not entrusted him with the money. Would he have gotten to the point where he would be able to find his pride? Even if Mama had entrusted him with only a piece of the money, Walter's share, would that have been enough for Walter to feel respected? And again, we don't know, but it certainly is something to contemplate. And the play ends, I think, quite fittingly with Mama taking her plant, because that plant is, of course, the family itself. So for today's attendance question, what I wanted you to do was spend a little bit of time doing research. So if you'll remember, we did this earlier on in the semester where I asked you to look up author biography for short stories and to pick an author and find some information about that author so that you could see how perhaps their biographical information might help you understand their text. Understanding, of course, that there isn't a direct correlation between an author's biography and the art that they happen to produce, but there oftentimes are parallels. And this time around, since we're reading, or we've read, three dramas from such different time periods, I thought what we could do is talk a little bit and research a little bit about the time periods. So, your attendance question, which will be due on the 1st of December, at Thursday at noon. Look up information on a culture or time period, and here are your three options. From 430 BC Greece, that would be Oedipus the King. Or 1595 England, that would be A Midsummer Night's Dream. Or 1959 United States, specifically Chicago, and that would be A Raisin in the Sun. And briefly indicate how that information helps you better understand the play. So basically, what I'm hoping is that there are enough of you who choose each of those three time periods that we can have a nice overview of some of the history. So you don't have to respond to your peers' responses, but you do want to read their responses. And I'll be talking about their responses a little bit as well. And that's it. If we were doing this in class, you would basically be given the class period and you could take as much or as little time to do it. And same sort of idea here. I know most of you will be tempted to go on Google. Might I suggest it's not the best research technique, that you probably would be better off by utilizing the resources that you've paid for, which are the resources available through the GCC library, and not just the hard resources, but also the electronic resources, specifically the databases, because all of those have been reviewed by librarians and employees that are hired to do that sort of work. So there's a certain level of authenticity that you can expect from these works. That's not to say that a mistake couldn't be made, but it isn't like the wide open net where just about anything could be posted anywhere. So that said, it doesn't necessarily make a difference to me where you find the information. You just want to find the information, make sure that it's valid. The sad thing about Google is that most people look at the first 3 or 4 hits. And then they stop looking, even though Google has generated hundreds of thousands of options. So we live in a unique time where we've never had more access to information, and yet we've never used less information. And I know that Wikipedia is probably a go-to as well. Keep in mind that Wikipedia is a very superficial source, just like back in the day when we used encyclopedias. The Encyclopedia Britannica would be very similar. It's just a summary, a compilation of some original works that other people have created based on a particular topic. So Wikipedia is perhaps a good place to start. It's what I call a good source for a junior high school book report, but probably not what you would want to rely on at the college level. And I'll never forget a comparison that one of my colleagues made about the distinction between using the wide open internet as opposed to using something like a database. And the comparison was to safe and unsafe sex. And that basically unsafe sex was similar to being on the wide open internet. That it probably, I guess, perhaps will be okay. But you never know. And that the databases were comparable to safe sex, meaning that yes, something could go wrong, but it's highly unlikely. And I've never forgotten that when I think about research. But again, I'm just interested in you poking around a little bit in the time period that interests you the most, whether it be 430 BC Greece, or it be 1595 England, or it'd be 1959 United States, and see if you can find some information that helps you understand the play a little bit better and briefly indicate how and why that helps you understand the play better. And the next class, what we will do is talk about poetry. So most students end up spending about maybe 20 to 30 minutes doing this exercise, but again, as long or as short as you want to do it. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class talking about poetry. Take care. Bye-bye.